it's good to see everyone. Thanks for joining us for this workshop on the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund, one of the funding programs offered through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Great Lakes Grant Programs Office. We are your team from Throwe Environmental. We're the field liaisons for this program, and we'll tell you a bit more about what that means and what kind of support we can provide. But today we are talking all things Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund, helping to give you some tips and tricks for successful grant submissions. So we can go to the first slide here. So this is what our schedule will look like for today. We'll start with a quick overview, and then we have multiple different sessions that'll take you through different pieces of the content for the day. So we'll start with some introductions about the program and then do a deep dive into the proposal narrative, probably the most important part of your application for this program and for any given NFWF program. Then we'll take a short break. We'll come back and we'll talk through the metrics, monitoring, and maintenance pieces, all those pieces that get a little technical that folks sometimes get confused about. So we'll work our way through those. And then we'll wrap up before we go to breakout rooms with a discussion about financials, match funding, budgets, all of that. And then the last piece of the day will be a short breakout session where you'll have the opportunity to switch between breakout rooms that cover each of the topics that correspond with these sessions throughout the day. So we'll hear more about that as we go along. And we will adjourn by 1 p.m. Eastern. We can go to the next slide here. So just some very basic logistics as a starting point here. Again, the purpose of this workshop is to provide funding tips and tricks, especially as things are moving all around us. Obviously, the funding environment has changed quite a bit this year. So we want to give everyone the best tools that they have available to put together strong, successful applications for this program and others. And this really is meant to provide you with, lessons learned and best practices that you can take elsewhere too, not just in other NFWF funding programs, but beyond. We'll use NFWF Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund as the starting point for today. That will be kind of the case study throughout the day because that RFP is currently open. But again, lessons learned will be broadly applicable. Just some very basic Zoom logistics. Of course, please stay muted when you're not speaking. If you have questions, you're certainly welcome to put those in the chat or raise your hand, and then we can have folks unmute at the end of each session. Oops. And as a reminder, we are recording. So you'll be getting a copy of the slides and the recording after this session. And it'll also be posted online, the recording. So you'll have access to it in the future for future RFPs or just as you work on your application. As we're getting started, just to see who's in the room, if folks want to put their name, the organization. I imagine most people in here are working in the state of Michigan, but if you work across the region, feel free to put that in the chat as well. You can go to the next slide here. And while folks are just putting in the chat who they are, I can give you a bit more information about who we are at Throwe Environmental. So we are the field liaisons for this program, again, which means that we support applicants for the Great Lakes grant programs more broadly through outreach, through one-on-one technical assistance, and helping with troubleshooting as folks work their way through the program. So I like to say that can happen before, during, and after an application is submitted. That means, we can help you brainstorm project ideas. We can help you think through, how you're framing a project or some of the language that you're using while you're actually writing and getting ready to submit. And then after the fact, if you're not selected for funding, that's a really great time to re-engage. We can take proposals that have been declined and help think through how you might rework those for future grant cycles. So that's some of the work that we do. We work with several NFWF programs nationally. And then beyond that, we do a lot of climate funding and finance work, community resilience and community infrastructure work at the local level. That takes us all across the country. So we're based up in Rhode Island, and we work quite a bit on the East Coast, the Great Lakes, but really we do work all over the country. So with that, we can go to the next slide here, and I will pass it off to Mark, who is going to get us started with an overview of the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund. This will be kind of the highest level view. And from there, we'll dive into individual pieces of this funding program that will hopefully benefit you all as you're preparing applications. Mark, I will pass it to you.
All right, thanks, Kyle. I really appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Belton with Throwe Environmental, and I'm just going to go through a brief overview. It won't take but a couple minutes, and then we'll really get into the nitty-gritty in the next section. But I will stop at the end of this overview to ask some questions in case anybody has any here at that point of the program, because we do want it to be an interactive conversation today. Next slide, please. Okay, the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund, the program overview. It's a mix of federal and private entity funding. You can see the blue box on the right with the different entities that are contribute money to the fund. On the federal side, it's the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forestry Service. And private funders for the fund are Cleveland Cliffs, the Fred and Barbara Erb Family Foundation, Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation. Since 2018, the fund has awarded more than $9.2 million to 39 different projects in focusing on the 7 counties of Southeast Michigan. And we'll give you a graphic representation here of that on the next slide. And here that is, as you can see, each dot represents, one of the 39 projects that have been awarded over the past several years. You can see the list of counties on your left. Most of the project awards have taken place in Wayne County, but you can see a smattering throughout the entire 7-section area. Next slide, please. All right, well, who's eligible to apply for the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund and who isn't? And there's a few takeaways I want you to think about on this particular slide. The first is that eligible applicants, include nonprofit organizations, state, tribal, local, and municipal government agencies, and education institutions. To be competitive, applicant organizations must demonstrate a capacity and experience that matches the scale of the project being proposed and the funding being requested. So keep that in account as you're thinking about your partnership group and which one of the entities in your partnership group should be the one to step forward and actually be the applicant. Thirdly, to be competitive, government entities must demonstrate a close partnership with at least one nonprofit and/or community organization. And then lastly, federal government entities cannot be the actual applicant, but they can be partners. So I'd like to kind of have a tagline on this slide that the key is the partnership. Next slide, please. All right, these are the 3 categories. And the key here is that you have to pick one when you actually apply. So it's important to kind of see which one you think your project fits best in. It's likely that you will have benefits of your project that incorporate all 3 or more than just one area, but for the application process, you do need to pick one to be the category in which you are applying. Let's just talk about them briefly. Category 1, expanding nature-based solutions and access to nature. Nature-based projects that improve stormwater capture and storage to reduce runoff, combined sewer overflows, and flooding. So it's mostly about stormwater, dealing with stormwater problems. Category 2, improving habitat quality and connectivity. So it's projects that improve the quality and connectivity of in-stream, riparian, upland, and wetland habitats. And then the third category is activate restored habitats and natural areas. By investing in long-term habitat stewardship, public access, engagement, and programs to help all people get out into nature. So again, the takeaway from this slide is there are 3 categories. You have to pick one, but it's certainly a good thing to have benefits, that exceed that particular definition of the category you applied in. Next slide, please. Okay, really my last slide on the general overview here is the timeline. The RFP came out earlier this month. Also earlier this month on the 18th, there was the NFWF applicant webinar, which has been recorded and is available for your viewing. And I would urge every applicant to take a good hard look at that. The third bullet here on the timeline is today's event, the virtual workshop with Throwe Environmental, the Field Liaisons for the program. And then October 16th, circle that one on your calendar. That's when the full proposals are due by 11:59 p.m. Central Time that day. All right, thank you. And at this point, that really ends the overview, but I'd like to open it up for any questions that anyone might have. And again, we're going to get into a lot of detail here in the next section, but certainly want to field any questions right off the bat. Let's go ahead and put up your electronic hand as that's probably the most efficient way to get that done. Okay, Chris, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So with that, I will turn it over to Max for the second section presentation.
Awesome, thanks, Mark. So this second session, we're going to dive into a little more detail on those 3 funding categories that Mark went over and just pull out some points to highlight and consider in each of those categories. So it might be a little bit of review for folks who did attend that NFWF funding webinar, but just want to make sure we're all on the same page here, and point out some things to keep in mind as you're writing your proposals. And then we're going to go into a little more detail on the narrative section of the application, and highlight some tips and tricks for crafting that narrative and making that as strong and competitive as possible. So just starting off with an overview of your application. These are all of the components that we'll be spending a little bit of time on today. So we have, of course, your title, abstract, and proposal description. These are your hook, your first chance to grab the reader and bring the reviewer into your project. We have the budget and budget narrative, which is a really important component of your proposal, which we'll spend a little more time on in a following session. And similarly, metrics and metric notes. Everyone's going to be required to measure the outcome of your proposal in metrics that are outlined in the RFP. And Sally's going to talk a little bit about those in more detail later on. And we have match. What match are you bringing to the table in your proposal? You'll be required to upload a project area map. And then we have the narrative itself. So going over the problem and solution that your project is addressing, the technical merit, how it aligns with NFWF programming, your organization's qualifications, your work plan, where you'll talk through timeline, roles, project activities, and then your partnerships and the community engagement component of your proposal. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about attachments, including letters of support and what to consider as you're developing those. So before we dive into those three project categories in a little more depth, just a few key points to highlight for all of these project categories as you're developing your applications. So first, projects should advance the goals of NFWF's Great Lakes Business Plan. So I'd encourage folks just to take a look through that if you're not familiar with it already. And ensure that you're aligning your project with, with the goals that NIFS was trying to address in the Great Lakes region. All projects must demonstrate capacity and experience commensurate with the scale of the project request. So basically, reviewers want to see that your organization has the experience and ability to perform the project as written. So just something to keep in mind, especially in that organization experience section of the narrative, and as you're talking about your qualifications, and also as you're looking at the scale of your project to make sure that your capacity is matching the scale of the problem in the project that you're proposing. All projects are required to report their accomplishments in terms of metrics. So these are the list of metrics that are in the RFP that you're going to be required to select in easy grants. So important to think about how you're measuring outcomes of your proposal. And I won't go into too much depth there because, like I said, Sally's got a whole section on metrics later on. All projects must address operation and maintenance needs for the project area. So all projects are required to have a maintenance plan that describes how the project area will be maintained for at least 5 years after project completion. Then match. So match is not required, but it is encouraged. Projects that are bringing a one-to-one match to the table can be more competitive than ones that aren't. So it's strongly encouraged, but we'll say if match is a limiting factor for you and your organization, you're still strongly encouraged to apply. But definitely be thinking about what match you can bring to the table, whether that's from partner organizations, from in-kind match, volunteer time, etc. And lastly, the project size that we're looking for here range between $150,000 to $400,000. All right, so now diving into our first funding category, expanding nature-based solutions and access to nature. So these are projects that support nature-based solutions that improve stormwater capture and storage and reduce runoff, combined sewer overflows, basement backups, or flooding issues. So the focus here is primarily on the installation and/or maintenance of nature-based solutions that are predominantly vegetative. So these are things like rain gardens, bioswales, tree planting, constructed wetlands, riparian buffers. So a range of vegetative solutions that are addressing stormwater. There's also a preference for projects that reduce runoff and contaminant discharge, so addressing things like sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen runoff. And also for projects that are increasing stormwater storage at a significant scale, which we define as greater than 100,000 gallons of stormwater storage capacity per year. So again, the focus should be on nature-based solutions that are predominantly vegetative. Projects with constructed elements it can be funded, but it should be used to complement a suite of nature-based solutions that are vegetative. So, the hard constructed elements of a proposal should not be the primary focus of a project. And projects here should be dual purpose. So projects should include enhancements to public natural areas or public access as well. So these can include things like trails and paths, promoting recreation areas, community engagement programming, community gardens. So as you're developing your proposal, should be thinking about that dual purpose element of how you can bring in public access to these Category 1 projects. And eligible work includes installation, maintenance, or improvement components. But applications proposing maintenance projects are required to discuss that project with NFWF prior to submitting an application. So just a flag if you're thinking about funding a maintenance project of an existing nature-based solution to reach out to the NFWF team as soon as you can. All right, so funding Category 2 is improving habitat quality and connectivity. So these are projects that support riparian, in-stream, upland, and wetland habitat restoration improvements that increase the quality of habitat and improve public access to or use opportunities of natural areas. So these projects can achieve a range of ecosystem benefits, including improved water quality, reducing erosion, increasing the complexity, connectivity, and quality of habitat, especially native or rare and critical habitat, benefiting multiple species of concern, including threatened and endangered species, maintaining healthy native species populations, and enhancing biodiversity. And again, we're looking for projects here that have that dual purpose. So projects should also include enhancements to public natural areas, or improve access to or use of these natural areas that are being restored. So there's a range of eligible activities that can be funded here. We've included a few on the left here in this box, including restoring pollinator habitat and stream bank stabilization, invasive species control. But there's a range of restoration activities that can be funded here. And just wanted to highlight that proposals should increase connectivity between natural areas. There's several ways to do this, whether it's restoring continuous habitats or parcels adjacent to already restored or protected areas, connecting natural areas via trail systems, and also improving access to habitats for priority species. And lastly, community engagement is a really key component to these projects as well. So priority is given to projects that meaningfully engage and benefit under-resourced communities. So as you're developing these projects, we encourage folks to think about ways to be bringing the community, into the project and how to get folks into these natural areas, whether it's through education, through public access, working with your partnership groups, but this community engagement piece is really important here as well. So our last funding category is activating restored habitats and natural areas. So these projects are focusing on previously restored habitats and natural areas, and those can include areas that have been previously funded by NFWF or other funding programs. And this is done by increasing community engagement through programming, public access, and long-term stewardship of these habitats. There's three main components of this funding category, and you should be hitting on all three of those in your proposed project. So the first is habitat stewardship. So this is increasing your organization and your partner's capacity to enhance long-term stewardship activities. So things like adaptive management, invasive species control, direct engagement with the community. You also want to be increasing access to nature in these proposals. So that's increasing your capacity to activate restored areas through direct community engagement. So these are things that encourage public use, public health, accessibility, and removing barriers to get people outside and into these spaces. I think about this more as like an education component. So education in nature, conservation-oriented training, volunteer development, stewardship. And that goes hand in hand with this third point here of public access opportunities. And this is more focused on improving the infrastructure to get people out into these natural spaces. So things like trail construction, public access points, and just general infrastructure that enables the use of these habitats for the public. And so generally for the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund, we have a timeline of 2 years or field seasons, but for this third category, you can go up to 3 years or field seasons. And thinking here too, in this third funding category, you want projects to be of sufficient size and scope to necessitate reinvestment in these areas, since these are areas that have been previously restored. Another note here, again, partnerships and community engagement are crucial. So long-term commitments to the community and engagement of the municipalities that you're working with are really important to successful Category 3 projects. And just a note here that funding under this category shouldn't be used to support long-term transportation to sites, standalone infrastructure like parking lots that aren't necessarily required for project success, or already planned and sustained site maintenance activities such as cleaning and mowing or annual repairs. These should be funding new initiatives to activate these restored spaces. And last note, if you're thinking about a Category 3 proposal, you're required to discuss your project in advance with NFWF staff. So if you're thinking about a Category 3 project, you should reach out to the NFWF Great Lakes team to discuss. All right, so now we're going to dive into the narrative a little bit. So the key components of the narrative have listed out here. Again, the title, description, and abstract we'll get into in a little more detail. Funding category, as Mark said, you're required to have your proposal fit under one of those three funding categories. There is a lot of overlap, so it's likely that your project might capture pieces of two or even all three of those categories. But you should indicate clearly which one specifically you're applying under. You don't want to keep your reviewer guessing on that one. So just be sure to be clear about that upfront of what is the main primary funding category that you're focusing in on with your proposal. And then on the right here, these are the 5 sections of the full proposal narrative itself. So the first section is your project activities, where you'll be elaborating on the actual primary activities that will be funded through the grant, and explaining how these activities will lead to the outcomes that you'll be talking about in section 2 of the narrative. So in that outcomes section, you'll want to elaborate on the outcomes that you've discussed previously, and highlight what makes them achievable, why they're important, why these are the goals of the project. In section 3, you'll touch on the metrics, which will be how you're measuring those outcomes in section 2. You'll want to discuss how your project will monitor and assess for those metrics that you've selected for your project. And yeah, again, Sally's going to go into a little more detail on metrics monitoring and maintenance in a little bit. The next section will be community impact, where you'll have a chance to describe the community where your project is taking place, who's going to benefit from this project, how you are, or will engage those community members throughout the project development and its implementation. And lastly, the project team and partnerships section. So this will be your chance to list the key individuals from your organization and their qualifications who will be active in the implementation of the project, and also talk about the partners that will be involved and what they're bringing to the table to achieve the outcomes and goals of your project. All right, so now we're going to get into some more general tips to consider as you're writing your narrative and these specific sections. So we'll start with the title. Often an overlooked part of the proposal, but it is your first chance to make a good impression and grab the reviewer's attention. So you want your title to be clear, descriptive, and engaging. So just have a brief example here of kind of how to consider revising your titles. We have an initial sample title of Restoring Wetlands and Community Access in Monroe County through Nature-Based Solutions, which is a pretty decent title, but definitely room there to be more descriptive, engaging, and kind of capture what's actually happening in that project. So we have a revised title here, Building Community and Ecosystem Resilience Through Green Stormwater Infrastructure that Benefits Wetland Habitat in Monroe County. So that second one is, calling out specifically, what the outcomes of that project are, what they're doing to achieve that project, and who's going to benefit in that wetland habitat. So something to keep in mind as you're writing your proposal, just to make that title as clear, descriptive, and engaging as possible. So next we have the abstract. So this is your chance to make an elevator pitch. And this is really where you'll be clarifying your primary project category, giving that high-level overview, and helping the reviewer organize the goals and outcomes of the project in their minds. So you want to be clear about the category that you're addressing, and kind of provide that high-level overview for the reviewer that's going to capture what the activities you're doing are and what the goals and outcomes of that project will be. And then we have the project description. So this is where you'll really reinforce those first impressions that you've made in your title and abstract. Provide a little deeper high-level overview. It's going to help reviewers quickly understand how your project advances the program goals and priorities. So depending on your project category, you'll want to clearly explain the specific nature-based solutions to improve stormwater capture and storage that you'll be making, the types of native habitat that you'll be improving, what priority species will benefit the regional implications of your project, and how natural areas will be activated if you're looking at that third funding category. So this is where you're going to go a little deeper in the abstract and clearly explain the goals of your project and how it's achieving the program priorities and goals. So then diving into the narrative, this is where you're really selling your project to the reviewer and making the case that your project should be funded. So a few things to consider as you are writing your narrative. You want to assume the reviewer doesn't know much about your project. So setting the context and describing the problem that you're looking to address is really important. But you don't want to go too far. So you don't want to waste space, talking about general environmental challenges facing the Great Lakes region as a whole. You only have 6 pages in your narrative, so you don't want to waste too much time on background. but you do want your reviewer to be up to speed on the local challenges that your project is looking to address. So describing that localized context and setting the scene for your reviewer is really important, so they can see how your proposed project is going to provide a solution to that problem. So after you lay out those challenges, your proposed solution and how that your project advances that solution is important. And you want to keep in mind here, the solution that you're outlining should match the scale of the problem that you have described in the context. So you want to keep that in mind as you're writing and as you're developing your projects, that scale of the solution should match the scale of the problem. Next bullet here is describing how your project advances federal, state, tribal, regional, or local strategies. Successful projects are often ones that are built out of additional planning or that are advancing goals that are already in place at the local or regional level. So if your project is building out of, a state, regional, or local plan that's already been developed, talk about that. How did this project come into place? Aside from, NFWF strategies in the Great Lakes Business Plan, what other strategies and goals of other organizations and entities is this project advancing? How does this kind of fit into the broader picture of similar groups doing similar work, addressing this problem throughout the region? So to the extent that your project can connect those dots, it's a really important point to highlight that. And lastly, use relevant metrics. So again, you're going to want to tie these back into the metrics in the RFP and make sure you're using those metrics and talking about how you are going to monitor and assess for those metrics, because that's the way that your project success is going to be measured. So next, I wanted to talk a little bit about partnerships and community impact. So partnerships are a really important part of successful projects. And these partners can be from a range of organizations, either community members and leaders, community-based organizations, nonprofits, educational institutions, other state, local, tribal government agencies, or federal agencies. So there's a wide range of partners and stakeholders who can collaborate or engage on these projects. So I think it's important to kind of look at your project and and see where there might be gaps in capacity and experience and knowledge, and bring in partners who can kind of address those blind spots. Would encourage folks to leverage your organization's existing partnerships. So to the extent that you've been working with other organizations on these initiatives, making sure all those organizations are coming to the table in your project is really important. And if there are partnerships or areas that you don't have established connections, looking at ways to build those out, build new bridges, make new connections, and bring different organizations to the table. Because having a range of stakeholders involved in these is a key to long-term success and sustainability of these projects. And long-term sustainability is certainly a point that reviewers are looking for, of whether the success of this project can be maintained over time. So bringing in partners that can help integrate your project and your process into other local programs and policies, or who can help promote community buy-in and engagement, are really important pieces of successful projects. So I have a few points here on pieces to amplify in your project narrative. The first I wanted to touch on is communication. So communication, both with your community and the audience of your proposal and project, is really important. So you want to be thinking about how you are bringing in the community and community members, both before, during, and after your project's development and implementation. Having ways for community members to voice input throughout the process is important. So amplifying and discussing your strategy for doing so in your proposal can really help you score points on that community engagement piece of your proposal. Scalability. So does your project have the potential to catalyze additional efforts where they haven't already been deployed? So this is a really important point that, again, is something that reviewers are going to look for. To what extent does your project, will it allow, neighboring communities, organizations, or your partners build on those efforts? Is there going to be any follow-up? Can similar efforts be undertaken in neighboring communities? So to the extent that your project after its completion has the ability to be scaled up locally and regionally, this is certainly something to touch on in your narrative. And similarly, transferability is an important point to consider as you're writing. And you should be thinking about your plans to transfer the lessons learned from your project to other communities and organizations or other local government programs and policies. We want these projects to to have transferability and to have the ability for others to learn from the successes of your project. So another key point to amplify in your narrative is your plans and thoughts on the transferability of these initiatives. So speaking of things that reviewers are going to be looking for, these are the evaluation criteria for the program. So they're kind of broken out into these three bins: conservation outcomes, budget, and technical. So these are kind of the things that you're going to be scored on. So under conservation outcomes, reviewers are going to be looking for the alignment of your proposal with NFWF program goals and Great Lakes Business Plan goals. Are going to be looking for those quantifiable metrics. So which metrics did you select? How are you quantifying them? How are you measuring them? Are those metrics strong? Appropriate monitoring of all activities and outcomes. So reviewers are going to look for your discussion of how you're measuring these outcomes, who's doing that monitoring, with what resources, partnerships, and community impact. So again, who are those partners and stakeholders that you're bringing to the table? How are they contributing? How are they having an impact on the community at large? Project long-term sustainability. So this is kind of the maintenance piece. How will the outcomes of your project be maintained? Who's doing that maintenance with what resources? So that's a really important part. We want the goals and the results of these projects to be sustainable in the long term. So the next category, budget. When reviewers are looking at your budget, they're going to look to see whether costs are allowable and reasonable. Do they follow the NFWF budget guidelines? We'll be looking for match contributions. So are you bringing any match to the table? Where's that match coming from? Are partners bringing match to the table, et cetera? And cost effectiveness. So how does the budget match in scale to the outcomes of the project? And lastly, the technical section. Reviewers are going to be looking to see whether your project as written is technically sound and feasible. They'll look at your project to see if the work plan, timeline, outcomes are achievable given the time frame, whether you're engaging the appropriate technical experts, using accurate data, looking at your compliance approach, if applicable, and past grantee success. So have you managed similar projects before? Have you done similar work before? And the transferability of that project. So again, are you thinking about how the lessons learned from this project are going to be able to be carried over to other organizations, local governments, et cetera? So a few things to consider and avoid as you're writing your narrative. So one thing I would advise people on is to avoid too much technical jargon or buzzwords. Again, you don't really know who your reviewing team is going to be. Some of them might be experts in your project field. Others might not necessarily recognize the technical jargon that you're using. So you want to make sure that your narrative as written is digestible to a range of audiences. You also should avoid providing too much background. Again, there's that 6-page limit on the narrative, and really want the focus of the narrative to be on your project itself, your goals, outcomes, how you're going to achieve those outcomes, etc. So dwelling too much on the background can kind of take away from some other really important parts of the narrative. And lastly, embellishing the template. So, these are things you're not going to get docked points for doing, but they help the reviewers kind of digest and understand your narrative. If you're changing the format of the template, tweaking font color, things like that, it can just be a distraction, and you don't want your reviewer to miss something in your proposal because you messed around with the template and added a section or put something in a font color that they couldn't read. So would encourage folks to follow that narrative template that NFWF provides. And a few other things, want to avoid too little. You don't want to have missing attachments. So letters of support are really important. Reviewers are going to look for those. So make sure you're including all of the attachments that that you should be in Easy Grants. Too little description on match and budget items. So the budget narrative is a really important piece of your application. So when you're listing out your match, you want to be descriptive of where that match is coming from, how it's being calculated, what the source is. And same for your budget items. You want to be including justification for those budget items in your budget narrative, and really making it clear to the reviewer, what that budget item is for, why it's necessary. So definitely avoid providing too little detail in that budget narrative section. And vague project outcomes. You want to be really clear with the goals and outcomes of your project and how you plan to achieve them. And so, yeah, just diving in a little more on letters of support, because these are a really important piece of your proposal. They can help demonstrate buy-in from your partners, from landowners if you're going to be working on private property, and kind of help dispel any concerns that the reviewers might have about the buy-in of your partnership groups. So you want to ensure that letters of support are specific for this application, that you're getting them from all relevant partners and parties. So you should try to get a letter of support from everyone in your partnership group. If you're working on private land, definitely want letters of support from landowners, from municipalities that are involved. So really important to think about, who are the main stakeholders in your project, and get letters of support from those important partners and stakeholders. And a few copy editing tips to keep in mind. A second set of eyes on your proposal is always important. No, it can get, if you're working on these for so long, it's easy to miss things because it's all in your head, and something that you think you've written, you might have not. And so having a second set of eyes for grammar, spelling, tone, flow is really helpful, especially as spend a lot of time on these narratives and writing proposals. Format, would encourage folks to keep to the NFWF template in terms of format. Consistent headers, bullets, and spacing just helps the reviewer clearly understand your proposal and narrative if you're not tweaking with the format too much. Digital tools can be really helpful in the right circumstances, so using spell check, AI, etc., to to check for that grammar, spelling, tone, identify any areas that you're lacking detail or clarity and conciseness. It can also be useful for checking alignment with the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund requirements, just to make sure you're not missing anything. So would encourage folks to use a range of tools and second set of eyes as you're developing these narratives to ensure you're capturing all of the requirements. And then submitting via Easy Grants, would definitely encourage folks to give yourself some time with Easy Grants. You should be saving frequently. You don't want to have a timeout happen and everything you've inputted be lost. Upload all required attachments. So these are always a good idea to just upload as they come in. So if you get a signed letter of support back, just go in and upload it in the attachment section. So it's there and done, and that way you're not just trying to scramble and get everything uploaded at the last minute. It can be helpful to just kind of build your Easy Grant submission piecemeal like that to keep everything in one place. Double check for errors in required fields. So you'll see that little red asterisk in specific required fields on Easy Grants. So just make sure that everything in those fields is looking correct and accurate as you're filling things out. There is an Easy Grants help desk. So if you're having any tech issues with Easy Grants, there is a helpline available. So definitely contact them. They're great and helpful. And lastly, would encourage folks to give yourself some time to submit. In the event that technical issues do happen and you're submitting at the last minute, the Easy Grants help desk is closed. It can be a bit of a scramble. So, would encourage folks to give yourself a day or two early to get everything into Easy Grants and try to submit. So you have some time to work out any technical issues that may arise as you're submitting. And a few key points to remember. Clarity is important. So you want to assume your reviewers don't know your project or your work and bring them up to speed and fill them in on relevant background to your project. You want to make sure you're aligning with funder priorities. So make sure you're referring back to that RFP, to the Great Lakes business plan, that you're highlighting relevant co-benefits and you're hitting the required points of the RFP. You want to sell the reviewer on your project. Your narrative is, your chance to make your pitch. You're trying to get the reviewer to, to think your project is one that, can't be missed and should be funded. So you want to develop that narrative in as compelling way as possible, to really sell the reviewers. And proofread and copy edit. You don't want to have those little errors in your proposal. You don't want that to convey that there was a lack of attention to detail on your submission, or that you might be having a lack of capacity to take on the grant. So as you're developing that narrative, make sure you're getting that proofread and copy edited at the end. All right, so that is it for session 2. If anyone has any questions on anything we went over there, I know that was a lot of information. So feel free to come off mute or type in the chat if anyone has any questions.
Great, thanks, Max. There is one in the chat. I don't know if you're able to see this. It says, for funding category 1, can you expand a bit more on the construction piece, specifically where you mentioned the priority focus on vegetative nature-based solutions?
Yeah, so again, the nature-based solutions that we'd be looking for here are primarily vegetative. So, nature-based solutions that we see a lot are, things like rain gardens, constructed wetlands, bioswales, urban forests, so things that are bringing in, that natural and vegetative element as the primary focus. Often in stormwater infrastructure, there can be some hard infrastructure components, which can be funded, but really want to make sure that the vegetative piece of those MBS is the primary focus of the funding. So if you have specific questions on a proposal, where you are considering, vegetative and hard infrastructure for your stormwater project, definitely reach out. We're happy to discuss project specific thoughts, either the Throwe team or the NFWF team. So hopefully that helps with that question. And I see someone asked for a link to the Great Lakes business plan. Yeah, we can throw that in the chat. And also these slides will be shared, and that is linked in the slides as well.
Mhm. And then there's another one here, Max. For category 3, you mentioned that the project should be discussed before with NFWF. More details on who they should connect with.
Yeah, so those details are in the RFP. That will be with Aislinn and Tracy. Aislinn and Tracy, I don't know if you have any other feedback on how you want folks to reach out and connect with folks to discuss those category 3 projects.
Yeah, hi everybody. You're welcome to reach out anytime. Oh gosh, my camera's not working. There we go. Reach out anytime via email or phone. Email is probably easiest, so we can get back to you quickly. Basically, just we're hoping to provide some guidance on your proposals. So it's important to check in and make sure we're in the right scope.
Thanks, Aislinn. All right, any other questions from folks on session 2? All right, well, seeing none, and then feel free to type any in the chat as we keep going, and we can address any other questions at the end, but I will turn it over to Chris.
Yep, at this point, everyone, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. I am going to leave a slide up just with a QR code and a link to our attendee survey. We're only halfway through today's workshop, but if you want to get a head start and plug in some information, it is not a very long survey, and we are very interested in your feedback and experience today. We'll, of course, share this again at the end and follow up with an email link as well. So everybody take 10, and we'll start back up just after, sorry, I'm Mountain Time, just after 11 Eastern. Is that right? No,
Noon Eastern.
noon Eastern.
There we go. Top of the hour. Either way.
Thanks,
Thanks, guys.
everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Why don't we plan to get started here in the next minute?
And Chris, as we get started again, I just want to make sure, I think we're recording again. I have a notification that says the meeting's being recorded, but I don't know if you paused it at all. So just want to make sure.
We are recording again. Thanks, Kyle.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Are we ready to go, Chris?
I think so. Let's get started with session 3. Thanks, Sally.
Okay. Welcome back from the break, everybody. So we're going to move on to session 3, which is the 3 M's. This used to be the 4 M's when Max did this section, but it's going to be the 3 M's this time. So we have metrics, monitoring, and maintenance. And we're going to look at this from the perspective of developing a good narrative and a good proposal. So we're going to take a little higher level view of metrics and monitoring to focus on how they should be incorporated into the narrative and thinking about building your project. And we can also dive much more into that in the breakout room for the details. And also there's a lot of good material in the RFP for metrics to drill down to specific questions on that. So next slide. So you can look at the list of metrics in the RFP, and you can see that they fall into like 3 different categories. One of them is habitat and ecosystem, which is going to be a key component if you're looking at restoration activities. So you're looking from a bigger picture, you're looking at riparian, floodplain, in-stream, wetlands, categories of activities. And in those situations, you would be looking at saying how many miles or acres are you restoring, how many structures are you installing, and within those categories of types of habitats, there's multiple ways of looking at the matrix and multiple choices you can make. So you want to be sure to look at that, and also the note section is really important because you'll be drilling down into, say, the types of species that you're going to plant in terms of vegetation and how, what kind of methods you're going to use for different things. And then as you're thinking about this, you're building this into your narrative of like, this is how we're advancing this is how we're going to measure it. So let's just talk about some of those general categories that are going to benefit habitat and ecosystem. So we have the restoration, we have the fish passage improvements. So the number of passage barriers rectified, the miles of stream to open. And again, these are just a couple of examples. There's a lot more in the RFP under the table. Removal of invasives. So number of acres of invasive vegetation species removed. And you're going to be documenting what kind those are going to be in the notes. Erosion control, how much sediment is going to be avoided annually going into the water system, the water body or the stream. The water quality, best management practice implementation for nitrogen or phosphorus reduction. Again, and you're looking at pounds avoided. And there will be resources that you can look at in the RFP to make these calculations if you need help with that. Next. The second 2 categories are the nature-based infrastructure and the community and economic metrics. So the nature-based infrastructure, there'll be a lot of options for stormwater storage in terms of how you're thinking about your project is going to capture stormwater, as Max talked about some of those types of things you can do regarding rain gardens, regarding other ways of capturing stormwater. So we want to look at volume of storage capture added annually. Again, we want to look at least 100,000 gallons per year there. For other nature-based solution infrastructure, we may be looking at total area of infrastructure, number of trees planted, miles of trails developed or improved, a number of access development or improved. Again, you want to think carefully about which it may be tempting to choose a lot of metrics because there's a lot of choices, but you really want to think about what your goal is and how it'll be connected to your outcomes and what you can measure for realistically and what you can report back on. So you want to keep the metrics to a reasonable number. You're probably going to be including a nature-based infrastructure, habitat metric, and also a community and economic metric or more of those categories. So for all projects, you want to think about in the community economic area, volunteer participation, how many hours, outreach and technical assistance, number of people reached. These could be in the communities, they could be volunteers, they could be also the communities that are impacted. What people are you going to reach in terms of the benefits of these actions that you're taking? And also the economic benefits. Lots of times these projects create or sustain jobs or provide workforce training for the field of restoration and stewardship. So it's really good to highlight that too. Next. And you'll also have an opportunity in the Easy Grant system to write specific notes on how you're going to measure this and what it's going to entail. Evaluation and maintenance is also a really important part of these proposals because NFWF really wants to see how these projects are going to enhance the habitat and go forward and be successful. So as you're thinking of writing the project, obviously you want to do monitoring to monitor progress during and after implementation, to track success and adaptively address any challenges or opportunities that come up while you're working on the project. And then you also want to think about long-term sustainability. How will the benefits be maintained or achieved or sustained over time? Is that going to be your group that's going to be doing that? Or is that going to be your group and other partners? Do you have a plan for future funding of those activities to implement the necessary long-term monitoring and maintenance? And this can be a great chance to tie back in your narrative about how this ties in with other regional programs or plans at the municipal level or with other NGOs. So you have a chance to show how success is going to happen going forward. That's really key. And that can also support as you're talking about transferability and scalability. So you can think about these metrics on different scales and different ways to reinforce the narrative and also to show that your project is going to be successful. Next. So here's a table that we looked at before when Max was describing the narrative. You could make the case that pretty much everything in here touches on metrics, or you could make the case that metrics touch on all of these categories. But we've highlighted here some ones that you can specifically think about focusing on, tying back into when you're looking at your narrative and you're saying, have I done everything? Have I tied the ends together? You can go back and look at your quantifiable performance metrics, make sure that that's clear. depending on what exactly you're focusing on. Are you focusing on habitat enhancement, stormwater storage, or natural area activation? And that you've highlighted to the reviewer what those metrics are that will show that goal being made. And long-term project sustainability, that's really important to kind of wrap up and say that this is how we see this going forward, and this is how it can be monitored going forward. And we have a plan. You may not have all the resources in place, but you can begin to lay that path out. Also, under the budget, you want to make sure that those activities, those personnel, those equipment, supplies, however you are managing your, whatever you're asking for is reflected in there, that will allow you to do the metrics that you claimed you want to do, and will allow you to do the monitoring. And so basically in alignment with the goals and the restrictions and the allowable expenses, you want to make sure that you've included everything that you're going to need to do that work, or described an in-kind offering for covering that work. Under technical, there's a lot of overlap here with, is this technically sound and feasible, logical and achievable work plan and timeline, engaging the appropriate technical experts? Are you looking at accurate spatial data? Do you have a good compliance approach for tasks that will need that? Again, there's a lot of metrics that will show up in these areas and reinforce your narrative when you're talking about how you're going to accomplish these technical aspects of the work plan, which are really important. And I'd also just like to say there may be, as you're thinking about your project, there may be a metric that you think ought to be included, but isn't included, and you have a good way of measuring it, and you think it's key to your project proposal. You can reach out to Aislinn or Tracy and discuss whether you can include that in your project, if that is key to telling your story and showing how you can be successful at doing that project. Okay, I think that is it for metrics, and we can also dive into more specific metric questions in the breakout room.
All right, thank you, Sally. Before we go on to the financial section, maybe let's see if we have any questions from all of our participants on metrics, maintenance, or monitoring. And again, feel free to put those in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, seeing nothing, why don't we move on here? We'll always have more time to ask those questions in the breakout room. If you have anything specifically on metrics, maintenance, or monitoring, there will be a whole session specifically for that purpose. All right, great. Well, I will pick it up here on the financial piece. So again, this will cover all things financial related to your proposal. That would be the request amount, the match funds, the budget, all of these different components we will touch on in this next session here. So we can go to the first slide. So I want to break down the different pieces of the budget and some specific requirements that you should be aware of when going after NFWF funding in particular. So you'll have your budget itself with the actual line items, that'll say the dollar amount per line item. But there's also a budget narrative, and that's where you have the chance to explain and justify the costs that you're requesting funding for. I would really encourage folks to use the budget narrative space wisely. It's not always required that you have to put text into each of the budget narrative sections, but it usually is to your benefit. So even though it's optional, I would take advantage of that space, explain the costs that you're proposing, and really spend some time on any that might confuse reviewers. If you've got, a lot of staff time for one person, but maybe they're not reflected in the work plan as much, that could be a potential red flag if you don't spend some time explaining why that's the case. So use that budget narrative space wisely. It's there for you to preemptively explain to folks why you're including certain expenses. So it's better for you to set that narrative rather than folks filling in the blanks on their own. Another thing to note here is that you need to stay in compliance with OMB uniform guidance. So that's the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level. They put forth guidance for federal funds. And of course, because NFWF is getting quite a bit of its funding from the feds, you'll want to stay in compliance with all federal rules and regulations. So there is guidance about OMB uniform policies online and on NFWF's website. So we don't need to go into the specifics today, but I do want to flag that, this is something that you need to remain in compliance with. And one piece that we notice that comes up a lot is on the procurement front, especially if you're a municipality or a nonprofit that has typically gone back to the same contractor, over and over the years, and really worked with a consultant or a contractor multiple times. We need to be able to see that those services have been competitively procured at some point in time, and it needs to be in alignment with that uniform guidance. So that's something that you'll want to look at to make sure that you're not inadvertently out of compliance, and that you check all those boxes ahead of time. And then, of course, another requirement to be aware of will be any prohibited costs. We don't run into this a ton. I think folks are actually pretty keen on identifying what is not allowed and then steering clear of that. But those would be things like research strictly for the sake of research, marketing, or land acquisition is another good example. So we can go to the next slide here. I want to break down, when we talk about the budget, what the specific categories are that you'll expect to see when you're putting together your budget. So these will be where the line items are categorized. And again, this comes up in the budget narrative where you'll be able to explain each section on its own. So of course, the first one here is salary and benefits. That's where quite a few expenses are incurred, actually paying for people to carry out the projects that you are proposing. Then there's equipment. There's some specific guidance in the RFP about equipment, what's allowed, what isn't, what should be rented where possible versus what should be purchased and left with the applicant after the project ends. Contractual services, if you need to contract out for an engineer or a planning firm, maybe for construction. Supplies and materials, those tend to be things under a certain dollar amount, more of like a one-time use, supplies for a workshop. That might be flip charts, markers, pencils, versus equipment, which tends to be over a certain dollar amount that has a longer term life cycle. Travel is something to consider, and I would encourage folks, if there's travel built into your project, obviously you want to account for that reasonably, but make sure that you're doing that. That is something that is allowed as an expense. That should be accounted for, the mileage, if you're renting cars, all of that can be included in your budget, and that'll help you avoid, unexpected costs down the road. And then any other direct or indirect costs, if it kind of starts to go into that miscellaneous category, this is where you will want to make sure you're explaining what those other costs are. And some things to consider, you'll see in this box on the right, are the time and money that it might take to carry out any type of like quality assurance planning or monitoring plans. If there's a community engagement workshop and you expect to be paying stipends for volunteers or participants, that's an allowable cost, but it'll need to be accounted for. We already talked about monitoring. And then, of course, the travel and actually, the materials, the room rental space, all of that you might need for workshops or community events. Sometimes those things fly under the radar with a big budget. So just make sure that you're taking the time to think through exactly what you'll need funding for. We can go to the next slide here. So as you're drafting a budget, here are some things that you'll really want to think about kind of big picture. Of course, you want to make sure that the budget is directly tied to the project narrative that Max talked about a few sessions back. There's a lot of information in that narrative section that's really where you're selling folks on the project. But the budget is where the rubber tends to meet the road, where you see, the staff that'll be carrying out project activities, the consultants that'll be brought in, the resources and the materials that are needed to actually achieve success. All of that, you might explain it and kind of qualify it in the narrative section, but you quantify that in the budget. So it's really important to make sure that the story that you're telling and the dollar amount that goes along with it, that they match up, that they're realistic, they're relevant, the costs that you're using are well researched. A good example here is if you're relying on volunteer time, you'll want to look up, what the going rate for volunteers is for the specific activity that you're using volunteer time for. Some are valued higher than others, so you'll want to make sure that that's relevant and it's really grounded in solid estimates. Again, you can use that narrative section to justify each line item. And I would say here, NFWF puts forward a pretty solid budget template. We have used that same exact template when we are, applying to be your field liaisons. So we know it well. It's there for a reason. So I would say don't stray too far from it. That template, the instructions that go along with it are there to help streamline the process for you and make review easier. So I would not change too much. And if you feel like what you're putting forward just isn't fitting, that would be a good point to reach out to the NFWF staff to try to troubleshoot. Go to the next slide here. I want to talk about match. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier. For this specific program, the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund, match is not required, but it is strongly encouraged. That tends to be the case with many NFWF programs these days. It's not always required match, but it is strongly encouraged. And it's encouraged for a couple of different reasons. I tend to think the most important one is what you see in the second bullet, using match to show buy-in. It's more than just the dollar amount, but it's bringing different partners and beneficiaries to the table and kind of asking at the review stage, is everybody contributing and kind of like putting their piece into the pie. You've got a lot of different partners that you might be engaging. You've got a lot of different groups or communities that are benefiting from a given project. Are they kind of bringing their fair share to the table? And match can be a great way to do that. Of course, match can be a very big limiting factor for folks, especially when it comes to cash match. So I would say, really think through the different types of match that you can provide. It does not just have to be in hand, cash on hand. It can be in-kind services, volunteer time, staff time, facility time. If you're renting a space. A good example that I like to give folks is if you're a nonprofit and you have maybe a land trust or a larger statewide nonprofit that's coming in and providing, staff to facilitate a workshop, or if they're providing a space for a workshop and they don't plan to charge for that, that's all fair game when it comes to the match conversation. So be creative, obviously be above board, but be creative. Think through the different sources that you realistically could account for during a project, and don't be afraid to be a little stingy and don't sell yourself short. Account for those things, because at the end of the day, it'll help with the cost ratio with your project between the budget that you're requesting and the match that you're providing. So you'll want to think through how you're valuing staff and volunteer time, and again, account for all services and facilities that you use. One thing to be aware of on match is that you have to differentiate between federal and non-federal sources, and they count differently. Non-federal is ideal here. That is what adds up to your total match percentage. So if you're requesting 100,000 and you're providing 50,000 of match, that would be a 50% non-federal match. If you do provide federal funding alongside your project that you're accounting for, that would be considered federal leverage, and it's accounted for a bit differently. It's not exactly the same, but it does help to tell a bigger picture of how many dollars are being activated for a given project. So just be aware of the nuances there. You can go to the next slide here, which I believe is the last one here. So just some overall guidance and some more mistakes to avoid. You really want to pay attention to the funders' priorities and help them think about this conversation of return on investment. So you'll see the priorities in the RFP, you'll have your project idea, and kind of put yourselves in the reviewer's shoes. Are they seeing a strong return on investment from your project? Are there areas where they're seeing risk? And if there is risk, how can you help to alleviate some of those concerns with the budget narrative section and by providing a little bit of match to help with that cost ratio? Talk to your finance team, your partner's finance teams. If you're bringing organizations together for a proposal, that's the great time to think through, like, how can we make this as financially viable for NFWF as possible? There are examples and template budgets out there, which we talked about. And of course, leave some solid time for budget review. That should not be the last piece that you just kind of throw on paper before you submit. And then very minor mistakes here just to pay attention to, but that can make things, stick out in a bad way during the proposal review. If you've got a budget that's totally out of alignment with the proposal for one reason or another, that can be a problem. You want to pay attention to the dollar amounts put forth in the RFP. So if there's a minimum and a maximum, and this program, it does have its set range, and you're above or below those numbers, that will be cause for concern. And we've seen on other NFWF programs this year, applications come in way beyond the ideal maximum, and that has been a deciding factor. So you'll really want to pay attention to that. You'll want to pay attention to how you're describing your costs. Again, don't be too vague or general. Make sure you have some specific information. Account for all your match. Make sure you're doing your math right and you're not missing anything, or the arithmetic is a little bit off. And then, of course, make sure you're accounting for those reporting and compliance costs. That may not be the most fun piece of the project, but it is something that you can certainly include in your budget to make sure that you're not running over. So with that is the final slide here. We're going to go to breakout shortly, but why don't we answer some of these questions that I see we've got in the chat here. Okay, so the first one here says, I think I saw that a one-to-one match would help the application. Would the review process give credit for less match, or is one-to-one the only thing worth pursuing? So again, there's no match required for this funding program. One-to-one is great. There's nothing wrong with the one-to-one match. 100% is a great ratio to come in at. Match is one of several criteria that are weighed in your application. So of course, if you provide a one-to-one match and someone else provides a 25% match, on the comparison of match, the one-to-one wins out there. However, it's not that cut and dry. They're also considering, the sources of the match. Is that funding in hand, or is that something that, you've identified a couple grants that you might go after, but you haven't actually submitted applications yet, and it's a little bit looser. So that's something to consider. The ability for the organization to actually provide match, I think that is something that's considered. So it's all part of the larger conversation. And then, of course, match is just one of the evaluation criteria. There are other pieces like, the benefits of the project, the scale that they're working at, the ability to transfer lessons learned that are also considered. So it's not the only thing that's worth considering is the match or the ratio. It's one piece of the puzzle. Next question here, when you complete the budget, do you submit a combined budget with the grant request amount from Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund with the funds from your match? Combined budget, the grant request amount. I think I understand this question. So what you'll submit to NFWF is the budget for what you're requesting from them. And then there's a separate section where you will detail the match that you have to provide to the project. So again, for example, if you're requesting 100,000, you would, list out those costs line by line. And then another section of the proposal, you would say, if I'm providing 50% match, I have 25,000 that's been pledged by my city council, 10,000 from a nonprofit, and 15,000 in volunteer time. There's my 50% match. But that would be done in a separate portion of the proposal from the budget. And I saw a thumbs up from Aislinn, so it looks like we got that one right. Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns on the budget piece before we go into breakout rooms? Volunteer time can be recorded following independent sector. Paul, I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you want to come off mute, maybe.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Sorry, I was just typing it out so fast it didn't make sense.
So
currently in 2025, it's $34.79 per hour according to independent sector. So like in calculating volunteer match, that's what I would go with, but I wanted to clarify that you were okay using that estimate.
Yep, that's a good question. I would say that that dollar amount, the 34 and change, is a fine starting point, but I would consider what the volunteers will be doing. A good example that I've used that has seemed to work is, if you have high school students with very little training that are doing a beach cleanup, that's relatively simple work that doesn't require a lot of training for those volunteers, that might be valued a little bit lower. But if you've had to train folks, they're recurring volunteers, it's a lot more involved work, then you're looking closer to that 34 number. So I wouldn't just say, 34 and not reconsider it all. There are things that will shift that up or down. But that's a good place to start from. And then, of course, you'll have to consider what the actual volunteers will be doing. Good question. All right, Chris, why don't I toss it back to you and you can get us ready for breakouts.
Okay. Can you hear me? We have reached the breakout portion of our workshop today. I'm going to keep it brief so we can maximize our time interacting. We will, in just a few minutes, be opening up 3 breakout rooms, each of them corresponding to the sessions on narrative, budget, and metrics, monitoring, and maintenance. So you will be prompted to join one of those 3 rooms. And for the next just about 30 minutes, you'll have an opportunity to discuss your proposal ideas and ask your project-related questions to the field liaison staff and our NFWF team that are on the call today. So I've already covered that. You will be prompted to join the breakout room of your choice. We will have staff in each one. Just again, come with your ideas and questions. And we will not be returning to the main room afterwards. Once your breakout room discussion has ended at 1 Eastern, you are free to go. But just a few slides to cover before we do breakout. We wanted to invite you after this workshop and after the breakouts, if you want to have a one-on-one discussion with a member from our field liaison team, Mark Belton and Max Centenary, who presented earlier today, are leading our Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund outreach. Here's their contact information. Everyone who participated in the workshop today will be receiving an email by tomorrow with our slides, with the recording, with a link to the survey we would love you to fill out, and with all the contact information you'll need. So no need to hurry up and copy this down. We will be sending it tomorrow. And finally, I'm Chris Cortina. I serve as the project manager for the field liaison team, and happy to answer any general questions. And you'll be, of course, receiving this email from me tomorrow, so you'll know how to reach me. So with all of that being said, you should be prompted here in the next couple seconds to join one of 3 breakout rooms. And I'll hang by and make sure we don't have any issues.